Come on, y'all. Butter that popcorn.
Good evening, one and all. You've landed on Take Two, the movie program on Public Radio KCBX. And with that opening music, we're not talking about classical music, but perhaps a filmmaker who has changed music to make us think of movies instead of perhaps the origins of the classical music. We just heard Thus Spake Zarathustra, written by Richard Strauss. But of course, whenever we hear that music, we do think about the Stanley Kubrick film 2001, A Space Odyssey, and leave it to the brilliant filmmaker to actually change music to make us think about the film instead of perhaps the original intention of the classical composer. And we're taking on the big one tonight, and actually it's going to take 3 shows to give a great appreciation to the great Stanley Kubrick. And to have that conversation with me is my great friend, it's Bob Whiteford.
And across the aisle from me, the undisputed czar of film on the Central Coast, Kubrick lover extraordinaire, my friend and yours, Jim Dee. And Jimmy, this is the big one. We've been wanting to do this for years, and now a 3-part Stanley Kubrick movie discussion. Think about it, Jimmy. Even with his short films, he's only done 16 movies, but we can talk about him for 3 hours easily.
I think the only other person we devoted 3 shows to was John Huston, and John Huston's filmography is much larger than Stanley Kubrick's. But we were talking about spending an entire show perhaps on a single film of Stanley Kubrick's, and we could do it. But we're going to try to shed some light on the Kubrick filmography that you may not be aware of, maybe a little more insight into a lot of his works. And of course, on tonight's show, we're going to be looking at early Stanley Kubrick, which doesn't get as much exposure as I think it deserves. And we're going to try to really do that tonight. And, just some of the basic information about the filmmaker Stanley Kubrick. In fact, interestingly, we've already, just by what we've said so far, have elevated him to, one of the greatest, if not the greatest film director. But he also has his detractors. Even when his films were getting released, they did not achieve the status that they eventually achieved. And even to this day, I think he has his detractors. Some feel he's the greatest film director ever, and others think otherwise. So I actually think it is that controversy, that not black and white view of Stanley Kubrick is what makes him so great.
Well, it's interesting, Jim. It seems like almost all of his films, maybe going back to Paths of Glory, all seem to be greeted with some kind of controversy and critical backlash upon their release. Maybe the exception, no, Dr. Strangelove caught a lot of critical flack too, although they were commercially successful. And it would seem that for whatever reason, these people who disliked Kubrick's offering so vehemently upon initial release still thought enough to go back and explore them again and again and again, and ultimately by viewing the films several times over after their release, completely changing their mind on what they felt about a film like Paths of Glory or 2001 or Clockwork Orange. And I think that's fascinating because I don't ever see that happen with other filmmakers.
Well, his films do withstand the test of time, and I do believe revisiting them, even if you do enjoy them or enjoy them on the outset, you see different things. I mean, for me, 2001 is a different experience almost every time I've seen it, and I've seen it dozens of times. And going back to examine what he has done in his short list of films, it's I would like to think that those of the film viewers who didn't think much of his films would take the time to go back, because it's definitely worthwhile going back to his films and revisiting them.
Well, Jimmy, it's interesting. And we were talking about this a lot off the air in leading up to this show. And the short list of films that he has done, yet that short list of films is on the big list of the best films ever made. And it's interesting, whatever genre he tackles, be it film noir, which we'll be talking about tonight, with Killer's Kiss and The Killing, he's at the top of that game. Then he goes to a war film, Paths of Glory. Surprise, surprise, one of the best ever made. Then he goes to Sword and Sandal with Spartacus, probably the best sword and sandal film of them all. And it just goes on and on. I mean, best satire, Dr. Strangelove, science fiction, 2001. And then you've got Clockwork Orange. I don't even know how to classify that. But it seems like wherever he goes, The Shining, one of the greatest horror movies of all time, he seems to just take on a genre and he makes one of the best films, if not the best, in that genre. I mean, I'm thinking about Full Metal Jacket. That's a great war movie, too. There's a lot to say. There's so much to say. And you might think, for a guy, even counting a few short films that you probably never saw, and his first feature, which you definitely didn't see, Fear and Desire, that we couldn't talk for 3 hours about this guy. Well, we're going to prove you wrong. Starting now.
Here are some basics about director Stanley Kubrick. He was born July 26, 1928, in New York. And even though he spent most of his life, or a good part of his life, living in Great Britain, I think we think of him as a New Yorker always. Stanley Kubrick died on March 7th, 1999, way too early, but shortly after completing Eyes Wide Shut. And there are a few things about Stanley Kubrick's films that we can say. The tracking shots, whether they are going from side to side, or whether we see Colonel Dax in Paths of Glory, walking through the trenches of World War I, or Dave Bowman going through the infinite. That's kind of a tracking shot through the infinity of space. The close-ups of human faces seem to permeate his films. And even though he has these visual things going on in a lot of his films, I also feel that each one is incredibly unique and hard to, the director is there in all of these films, but each one of his films is very different. Now, a couple of starting points we should mention to our listeners, Bob, are two books. Actually, there's three books. And we talk about the very early career of Stanley Kubrick getting a job as a still photographer for Look magazine. And he was barely in his teens. He was 17, and I had always read about him being a great photographer for Look. And it was only about 3 years ago that a book was released of all of his work for Look magazine. It's called Stanley Kubrick, Drama and Shadows. And it's a really great starting point, I think, because here you see a teenager Stanley Kubrick in the work that he did for Look magazine. Then there's the ultimate coffee table book. In fact, we've joked about the fact here's a book that you can actually use as a coffee table because it weighs about 15 pounds. It's called the Stanley Kubrick Archives. And if you're a fan of Stanley Kubrick and you don't have this book, it's the ultimate book. There's another one called Kubrick by Michael Chiment, which is also very good. But starting point, Stanley Kubrick, Drama and Shadows of his still photography, and then the Stanley Kubrick Archives, which has all of his interviews, great stills from his films, including stills you haven't seen. Those are great starting points and good books to get to dovetail off of this show. But let's go back to these early days, Bob. I mean, again, he's barely, he's wet behind the ears, and he's got a great job at Look magazine as a still photographer, and then, of course, segueing into filmmaking.
You know, this is interesting, Jim, and I think, especially for younger listeners out there, the Kubrick the formative years are very interesting. Here's a guy, he was very bright, but he did not do well at school because he just found he was kind of constrained by school. In fact, when he graduated, he went to William Howard Taft High School in the Bronx, and he got a cumulative average of 67, which was very similar to what it was when I graduated high school. I think mine was 63. I had to go to summer school, but I'm making my own personal connection here. And the thing was, when he was 17, that was 1945. World War II was ending. The GIs were coming back, and because of the GI Bill, they were getting the slots and justifiably so, I might add. He would even agree with that. In fact, I heard it in his own words, thanks to you, Jimmy, that the GIs were going into school. And for a young guy like himself, the only way he could even get a shot at going to college was his grade point average had to be 75. And it wasn't. It was 67. And oddly enough, he said he hated reading books as a young person because he saw it as homework and it was annoying and he didn't like the way it was taught. And he had a teacher who taught Shakespeare by dramatizing it. And that's when the light started to open. That's when the light shined on him, because he saw this teacher take a subject matter that he just hated, and he knew, you got to read 5 pages, and the next day if you don't read it and they ask you a question, you have to stand up in front of the class and you get a 0 and you're humiliated. I remember they were still doing that when I was in school. And this teacher, I can't remember his name because Kubrick never forgot him. And he kind of turned it into a drama, like a radio drama. Instead of a book, everybody's got a script and you're all reading and you're getting involved and you understand it better. And that's when the light went on. Now, he can't get into college, so he suddenly picks up a camera because he loves movies. Mm-hmm. Back in those days, people were movie crazy. And he said, it was interesting in the interview, he said there were no art houses back then, no place like the Palm to see a foreign film, like the Italian neo-realists, like Roberto Rossellini, etc. He said you could see them at a museum. And he said he would go to museums to see foreign films, and he would go see everything else that was going on. So here he is. He's a look photographer at 17 because he can't go to college, and they're printing him right away. He had an editor, a woman who was in charge of the photography department, who was blown away by him. I mean, he brought in his first photo project, his first photo story was on his English teacher, and it got published. And he took a lot of photographs around the Bronx when FDR died, and they were published. It's like right off the bat, the guy's hitting on all 8. Then one day, He's talking with a friend. I'm getting to the movie part now, folks. So thanks for bearing with me. He talks to a friend of his that was making the March of Time newsreels. And he was saying, well, how much do they cost to make? And his friend says, oh, $40,000 per. And Kubrick's saying, you're making a profit. You have to spend $40,000 and you're making a profit? He goes, oh, yeah, yeah. So Kubrick goes home and he thinks, now if I could, he calls Kodak in Rochester, New York, and he finds out what film stock costs and developing and whatnot. And he says, I could do a documentary film for $3,000. And if I can sell it, I can make, a ton of money. If this guy's making money laying out 40 grand, I can make even more money by laying out 3 grand. And he said, I bet I could do a better movie than he can. And sure enough, he did a film on the flying priest.
Yeah, it was called Flying Padre, and it was made for RKO in 1951.
Well, here's the backstory on that one, Jimmy. It's really funny. He kicked down some money. I'm getting a little ahead of the game, but Gerald Fried, who did music to the Killer's Kiss, The Killing, Paths of Glory, a great movie music composer in his own right, but was a friend of his from his youth. And he helped kick down on this first film, and they did it for $3,900. He went a little over budget. Well, you could figure it's Kubrick, right? He's got to, get the priest to he's sitting on the set for a week trying to figure out his next shot. So he's a little over. And he's trying to sell the picture. He's produced it himself. And everyone's interested in buying his film, but they'll only give him $1,000, $1,500. And he's going, what am I going to do? I'm taking a bath on this. He said he had no problem finding people who wanted to pick it up. But so finally, RKO Pathé, which I don't think was on the verge of going belly up anyway, but they paid him $3,500. So it's the only picture he ever made, he said, that lost money.
That's a good point, Bob. I mean, all of his films, despite him being labeled as, eccentric and, kind of a artist in his own bubble, all of his movies were moneymakers. But, interestingly, when you talk about him getting into movies, to paraphrase Kubrick, he essentially said he saw so many bad movies that he said I can do much better than this. He did see those great films in the museums, but I think he was a movie addict, a big movie fan, but Huge. He saw so many that he says, I can do better than that. Another thing about his education, another thing we should mention to our listeners is the documentary on Stanley Kubrick that's included in the DVD sets. It's Stanley Kubrick, A Life in Pictures. And I think it's his brother-in-law, Jan Harlan, who ended up being his producer or working on a number of his films with him, who basically talked about school and had the response that, well, I'm just not interested. That if Kubrick applied himself in school, he could have made straight A's in his sleep, but he just was interested in other things. And, it wasn't a casual offhand remark or being kind of a smart aleck or anything. He just wasn't interested in what was happening in school. He had other interests, but he was extremely intelligent. But looking at the early career, in fact, Bob mentioned Flying Padre, which he made for RKO for, $3,900. After that, also in the same year, 1951, Day of the Fight. And then we get to 1953, where he made 2 films. His first feature film was called Fear and Desire. Very hard to find that one. That one's quite obscure despite the notoriety of the director. But also during that year, he made his first color film, which was a half-hour film called The Seafarers, which was all about sailors. And leave it to my good friend Bob to have a copy of the Seafarers. And we have a little bit from that half-hour documentary film that Kubrick made in 1953, also the year he made Fear and Desire. We have a little clip from it from the opening of this film, which he shot and edited, did, the whole shebang for. And what I like about the opening of this film, the narrator talks about the film you're about to see, and also what it takes to be a seafarer. And I thought it was interesting to parallel this description of men of the sea and the man who was making the movie. This is from Stanley Kubrick's 1953 short film called The Seafarers.
I'm Don Hollenbeck. Joseph Conrad wrote a lot of things about the sea, and among other things, he wrote this. The true peace of God begins at any spot 1,000 miles from land. And here's something else I came across the other day that interested me very much. Ever since the days of sailing ships, seafaring has drawn to it men of many different types. And yet they have one thing in common, these men. It's the quality that makes men want to live not in a city or in a town, but in the world. It's a true spirit of independence, and it's always been deeply rooted in the seafaring tradition. And now to go on with this little essay, nobody knows better than a seafaring man that any man, however independent he is, isn't entirely independent. He's a member of something larger, of a family, of a community, of a nation. Or bring it back to seafaring. He's a member of a crew of men like himself, banded together for one essential common purpose. Now, the picture you're going to see now is the story of men who are banded together for one essential common purpose. This is a vital story in their daily lives and their achievements. It's a proud story, made possible by the deeds of seafaring men. It's the story of the SIU.
From 1953, that is one of the very first short films that Stanley Kubrick made, actually about his third short film. It's called The Seafarers, and, I just like that introduction because it almost mirrors Stanley Kubrick himself, an independent, free-thinking person, despite the fact you are sort of part of this larger whole. However, I tend to think of that introduction and Kubrick being drawn to this subject of the independence of a guy, out in the sea, or what is the most precious or greatest place on earth, 1,000 miles from any shore. And I just heard this sort of parallel how Kubrick could be drawn to this subject in 1953 to create his first color film, a 30-minute documentary called The Seafarers. Now, also in the same year, Kubrick himself will not speak very highly of his first feature, Fear and Desire. And Bob, it's really hard to find, isn't it, his first
Impossible. In fact, I'm betting that probably Kubrick's widow is the only one who has access to the film. For whatever reason, he screened it, didn't like it, never showed it again. And it's weird. It's kind of like a war movie. We've seen stills from it.
Yes.
It has Paul Mazursky is in it, the filmmaker, back when he was an actor. And I think it also had one or two other, oddly enough, named people in the cast. But the film has pretty much disappeared from viewing. I've never seen it. You've never seen it. I don't think anybody out there has seen it.
And I just wonder, too, if out there are copies of those first two documentaries that he made, Flying Padre and Day of the Fight. I mean, it's great that you had the copy of Seafarers, and it was fascinating to watch that. And just thinking that here's this kid, I guess he was about 21 when he made these, and they're great. They show the great promise, and he had it down. I mean,
absolutely. And I hope someday we get to see Fear and Desire, only because I'd really like to see him from his starting point. Although the first film the first feature film we really have to look at, which I think came out in '55, Killer's Kiss,
Yes.
is a fascinating film noir. And here's a film, Jimmy, it's 67 minutes long. It's got a great score by his buddy Gerald Fried. It's got an interesting cast of unknowns. It's shot on location in New York City back in the day. It's got artsy shots in it. It's got some great negative reverse imagery to it. It's got a great scene of Davy the boxer in the dummy factory, hiding amongst all these arms hanging off the ceiling. And it's all in 67 minutes. And it's a really terrific example of an independent film. I mean, it was picked up by United Artists, but Kubrick did it all himself.
He did do it all. I mean, with the end credits, I mean, we're going to play a couple clips from Killer's Kiss, but when it gets to the final credit, it's like written, edited, directed,
produced,
photographed by Stanley Kubrick. Why don't we play the trailer? I mean, this is, film noir at its best. I love this trailer stuff.
Oh, it's a scream.
Here's the trailer from Stanley Kubrick's 1955 film Killer's Kiss.
And out of the city's jungle night comes the clawing, burning impact of a killer's kiss. It hits with the gut shock of a knockout punch. A picture as brazen as the naked bulbs of Broadway, and as hard as the New York streets where it was shot.
Can't you get it, Vinny? To me, you're just an old man. You smell bad.
I could kill you right here and now.
Oh, I don't think you will.
I wouldn't be too sure of that.
Don't kill me. I don't want to die. I'll do anything you say. Anything.
He was lost as soon as he looked at her.
I love you.
Caught in a double cross, as dirty as the alley where they planned to end it.
I'm gonna count to 3, and if you still don't know, I'm gonna blow your brains out. 1, 2. She's in a loft on 24th Street. How'd she get there? Boys are waiting in her apartment. Is she all right?
All rules are off. All fouls are fair. As man meets murder in the stabbing, slashing climax that's the payoff for a killer's kiss.
Ah, Bob, we love that stuff, don't we?
You betcha, Jimmy.
That's from Stanley Kubrick's 1955 film Killer's Kiss. And, as sensationalistic as that sounds, the film is really something, as you said, Bob. I mean, there's this crisp black and white cinematography. There's some tracking shots in a dream sequence that are standard Kubrick. But the film is really entertaining and starts off similarly to a number of his other films, where we almost start midway through the film and then we go back in flashback and find out how we got there. That happened in Lolita. It happens in this film. I can think of others off the top of my head perhaps, but right out of the gate, Kubrick is using these interesting ways of getting us right into the film. In fact, before we take our break, let's hear this opening of Killer's Kiss. We open after the credits. We're in a train station. There's our main lead is sort of walking around smoking a cigarette, and we hear the voiceover narration. This is from Killer's Kiss.
It's crazy how you can get yourself in a mess sometimes and not even be able to think about it with any sense, and yet not be able to think about anything else. You get so you're no good for anything or anybody. Maybe it begins by taking life too serious. Anyway, I think that's the way it began for me. Just before my fight with Rodriguez 3 days ago.
There's the hook in Killer's Kiss. Kubrick gets you right into it. We were talking about a young Kubrick making these films, Bob, and, when we did our tribute to Orson Welles, we think about Orson Welles being 25 when he made Citizen Kane, and yet here is Kubrick, just making great films is when he's just a kid, but also using those hooks to get us in, and the cinematography is incredible, but, using these things to get us right into the movie where you're kind of hooked from the get-go. And I think he's done that on many of his films. They talk about Kubrick being slow-moving and ponderous and so on and so forth in some of his films. I think, I get hooked right in, especially on these early film noirs that he did in the 50s.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jimmy. I mean, Killer's Kiss and The Killing are pretty much action from the first frame to the last. There's just nothing wasted, and they're very entertaining. And it's interesting because those two films put him at the top of one of our favorite genres, film noir.
You're listening to Take Two, the movie program on Public Radio, KCBX and KCBX HD1 San Luis Obispo, KSBX Santa Barbara. We're streaming at kcbx.org, and you can write to us at movies@kcbx.org. Back with more on Stanley Kubrick in a moment. Support for KCBX comes from Pedro Arroyo and Fred Friedman, presenting Argentinian accordion virtuoso Chango Spaziuk, Tuesday, April the 7th at 8 p.m. at Congregation Beth David on Los Osos Valley Road in San Luis Obispo. Information at kcbx.org.
Support for KCBX is provided by Kenneth Volk Vineyards, inviting you to the Santa Barbara County Vintners Festival, Saturday, April 18th at River Park in Lompoc. Tickets and more information available at sbcountywines.com.
Hi, everyone. You're on Take Two, the movie program on Public Radio KCBX. Bob Whiteford is here with me. My name is Jim Dee, and we're talking about one of the big guys of cinema, Stanley Kubrick, and we're looking at his early career, and we're heading through the 50s with his early work, including some early documentaries and Killer's Kiss, which is out on DVD. In fact, you should check that out. We highly recommend his the first film. Well, it's not his first film. Fear and Desire is that unknown film, or not unknown, but unseen film. Killer's Kiss, though, we highly recommend if you're a Kubrick fan and you haven't seen it. But now we segue into The Killing, which is, similar title of Killer's Kiss, but a completely different movie, and further showing Kubrick's mastering the direction of this film, made in 1956, and also starring Sterling Hayden, who would show up later on in Dr. Strangelove as General Jack D. Ripper. In this film, continuing Kubrick's working in a film noir genre. Fabulous film, and again, if you haven't seen The Killing, it is worth a look.
Jimmy, I don't even know where to begin with this one. Let's just say, okay, here's a few things we'll throw out there. This is the first collaboration between Kubrick and producer James B. Harris. This is also the first collaboration between Stanley Kubrick and the great crime pulp novelist Jim Thompson. They would also work on Paths of Glory. It didn't last very long, but listen to this cast, folks. Film noir aficionados, please take note. This film stars Sterling Hayden, J.C. Flippin, Ted DeCorsica, Elisha Cook Jr., Vince Edwards, Joe Turkel, who's in I think this is the beginning of him being in every Stanley Kubrick movie, almost.
At least 3 I can think of.
Yeah, I think he was in this, Paths of Glory, The Shining, playing Lloyd. Or no, he wasn't Lloyd. Yeah, he was Lloyd.
Lloyd the bartender.
Let's see who. Oh, and 2 great film noir. You've got Colleen Gray as the film noir good girl, and the baddest of the film noir bad girls. And of course, I'm talking about one of my favorites, Marie Windsor. That's the cast. And it's also, you've got Timothy Carey as well. Holy cow. Tim Carey's in this at his psychotic best. You've got James Edwards, a great character actor. The film is just loaded with great performers who have great roles, and this is in a genre all of them are veterans in, and this is still probably the best stuff they've done. And it's one of the best heist movies I've ever seen, and it's got a great score by Gerald Fried. And Jimmy, when they're trying to divvy up the loot, and things, of course, go haywire because Elisha Cook can't keep his mouth shut, and he's talking to his wife, who's played by Marie Windsor. So Elisha Cook is dead meat right there. And she's, of course, hanging out with Vince Edwards on the side as Val. And when he comes in with Joe Turkel and shotguns and decides they're going to hijack the loot, the shootout in a small room with shotguns, you could imagine it's carnage. Kubrick, this is one of his great signature shots as well. He just pans the room afterwards, and bodies are like all over the place, and it's just very slow. Like you just see some guy's legs sticking up, and the music, Gerald Fried's music, is just perfect. It just right on pitch every step of the way. It's a memorable scene in a movie that has nothing but memorable scenes. But this is Kubrick. It's not a collection of scenes, and isn't this a great movie? It's great scenes woven together so well. I mean, there's just the little guy who has the motel, who's his boy's, doing time, and he asks Sterling Hayden, how's my boy doing? He's a stand-up guy. He's in there pitching. It's like the pros. It's just, this is a fantastic movie.
And I think the undercurrent here really embraces the idea of film noir and the fact that you would call the killing extremely existential. Not to get too heady here, but won't reveal the ending of this film, but the way it ends is perhaps not what you expect, but very interesting. But also the fact of, kind of the, let's say, film noir is about getting nowhere, or the fact that life is pretty meaningless. And I think Kubrick really embraces this in The Killing. Why don't we hear a clip from The Killing? Here's our boy Sterling Hayden. And I also want to make mention on this clip that Kubrick uses a narrator, and it kind of helps it along. Maybe he didn't need the narration, but he does use it. It gives it almost a documentary feel. This is from The Killing.
At 7 p.m. that same day, Johnny Clay, perhaps the most important thread in the unfinished fabric, furthered its design.
None of these men are criminals in the usual sense. They've all got jobs. They all live seemingly normal, decent lives, but they got their problems, and they've all got a little larceny in them. Now, you take my pal Unger, for instance, the guy who owns this apartment. He's putting up the money to operate with it. He's letting me stay here. He's a bookkeeper. Been with the same company for 10 years. Fay, the biggest mistake I made before was shooting for peanuts. 5 years have taught me one thing, if nothing else. Anytime you take a chance, you better be sure the rewards are worth the risk, because they can put you away just as fast for a $10 heist as they can for a $1 million job.
Truer words have never been spoken, you know.
Or better spoken.
Better spoken. You know, that's an element that will run all through these Stanley Kubrick films, especially when we get into our next film, Paths of Glory. The script is so intelligent, but it's savvy and it's smart, and it's, you know, not only smart in one level, but street smart as well. And you hear that in The Killing here, especially with this heist where it's slowly building up to this heist that it's going to take place, the squabbling between all the those who are taking part in it, and it's a great film. It's one of these films, Bob, well, I'm such a fan, but you know, you watch it and you just want to watch it again, just the way it was done, just the performances, the way it's put together, and we highly recommend The Killing.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jimmy. In fact, I think The Killing really matches up well with some of the great, what you're brought up the great word existentialism, some of the great French gangster movies like Grisby and Bob Lee Flambert, etc., in the sense that this is also about the criminal code. They have a code of ethics as well, and that thread is deeply ingrained in this as well. In fact, if things go awry, it's because the criminals don't obey their own code. And this is just a wonderful film. It's a fascinating watch. And like Jim said, with any Kubrick film, even if you've seen this film, go back and see it again. You're going to find other things that you may not have seen before.
Well, we've mentioned that Kubrick's early years, he's really made an impact because he's impressed people in the fact that he knows what he's doing. But I think, Bob, you know, it was 1957, Paths of Glory, which really put him on the map. I mean, this film not only was incredible in and of itself, very controversial. In fact, it was banned for how many years?
I think France, it was made in 1957. It wasn't shown until 2002.
Wow.
How about that? And I think this is the beginning of Kubrick's there seems to be controversy surrounding a lot of his films at their initial release, starting with Paths of Glory.
It was a war film, just unlike any other. It takes place in World War I. Again, a collaboration between Stanley Kubrick and Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas did have a lot of input in this film. In fact, maybe even more than Stanley, since I think this and Spartacus were projects really with Kirk Douglas having a lot of say. But it takes Paths of Glory, not only it's a different type of war film, but B, we're also looking at the Kubrick trademarks. Just watching Colonel Dax, portrayed by Kirk Douglas, walking through the trenches, those famous tracking shots. I mean, we don't want to jump too far ahead, but it's Kirk Douglas walking through the trenches. We see Danny Lloyd, tricycling through the corridors and the hallways in The Shining, or tracking shots where it's almost as if the movie is coming at you, is one of Kubrick's trademarks, and he did it amazingly well in this film. Plus, when we see the actual battle scenes, I mean, they're massive, and they're probably very true to what World War I was like.
Well, Jimmy, I think what really sets Paths of Glory apart from all other war movies up till that time is, I think some films inferred this point, and I'm a fan of the genre, but this is the one that really spits in the face of parade ground heroics and really shows it for what it is: dirty, brutal on the battlefield, and the callous disregard at the upper echelon of the command structure. I mean, in World War I, and this film pointed this out, and this is why the French, of all people, banned it for so long, was during World War I, the general staff was so out of touch with what they were doing, what the results of their stupid orders were. They were getting their people slaughtered. And there was a revolt in the French army, which was something, and the British army too, but especially the French army. I mean, they literally picked up their guns and walked the other way. They just started walking out because they were being slaughtered. And their leaders didn't seem to care and gave them no shot at winning. And this film really nails it on the head. And I got to say, there are some incredible performances in this film. One, Kirk Douglas is fantastic as Colonel Dax. Number two is Adolph Menjou and George McCready as the upper echelon officers are also incredible in their pompous stupidity, martinet mentality, buck passing. And, you know, it just goes to show that stuff never goes out of style. And I think it's also fair to mention the three soldiers that are selected to be shot. And that's Ralph Meeker, who's a great star. He never quite got as far as he probably should have, and that's a shame because he was terrific in this. Joe Turkel is the other one. And let's not forget Timothy Carey. I don't want to die. I had to do that.
Oh, it's perfect.
But behind the scenes, there's some interesting stories here as well. One, when that scene when Carey's being taken off to be shot, I mean, was it Joe Turkel is in a stretcher because he has a concussion. So even though he's brain dead, they're shooting him anyway, which also shows the utter ludicrous stupidity of the whole exercise. But there's Carey breaking down, and he's ad-libbing it, and Kirk Douglas, when he's passing Kirk Douglas in the massive formation, and Douglas is disgusted looking at him, that wasn't acting, folks. Kirk Douglas hated that scene. He was furious. And that was the one battle that Kubrick won against him. And I don't even know if it was something Kubrick really wanted. He just wanted, because he was a chess player. He had to win one over Kirk Douglas. And by giving Tim Carey that chance to really chew on the scenery, it was a victory for Kubrick as well. And one more small tidbit, and then I'll shut up, is the woman who sings at the end, the captured woman, Christine Kaufman, I think was the name, became Stanley Kubrick's wife. He met her on the production of this film, which was actually shot in Germany, or West Germany back then. And that's the woman he spent his whole life with.
Yes.
So it's a fascinating story. And the backstory about how Jim Thompson lost his screen credit to that's kind of interesting too, but we won't go into that because the end result is this is a great film. And Jim, you mentioned it earlier, people who are saying Kubrick too long, too ponderous, this film weighs in at about 88 minutes.
Oh, and
it's brisk. It moves so fast, it's over before you know it.
Here's a scene from Paths of Glory, and, it is Kirk Douglas along with Adolph Menjou and George McCready. And to give you a little backstory of the fact that what's happening here is Kirk Douglas's regiment is ordered essentially a suicide mission. And when half the guys are dead and some of them remain in the trenches, that's where the problem starts. But there's a very interesting thing in this scene, which we'll tell you about that you can't see. Here we have a scene from Paths of Glory.
I ordered an attack. Your troops refused to attack.
Our troops did attack, sir, but they could make no headway.
Because they didn't try, Colonel. I saw it myself. Half of your men never left the trenches.
A third of my men were pinned down because the fire was so intense.
Don't quibble over fractions, Colonel. The fact remains that a good part of your men never left their own trenches. Colonel Dax, I'm going to have 10 men from each company in your regiment tried under penalty of death for cowardice.
Penalty of death?
For cowardice! They've skimmed milk in their veins instead of blood.
Well, that's the reddest milk I've ever seen. My trenches are soaked.
That's just about enough out of you,
I'm not going to mince words and stand out.
Colonel Dax, if you continue in this manner, I shall have to place you under arrest.
I believe the colonel has a point, even though he makes it rather bluntly. This is not a trial, but it does bear certain aspects of one, and Colonel Dax technically is cast in the role of the defense. In view of the gravity of the charges, a court of law would grant him all possible latitude in presenting his case.
Latitude is one thing, insubordination another.
I am merely offering an opinion, General. Please do not feel constrained to accept it.
I'm perfectly willing to accept it, General Brula.
I'm sorry, sir. I certainly didn't intend to be insubordinate. My only aim is to remind you of the heroism these men have shown on every occasion in the past.
We're not talking about the past. We're talking about the present.
But don't you see, sir? They're not cowards, so if some of them didn't leave the trenches, it must have been because it was impossible.
They were ordered to attack. It was their duty to obey that order. We can't leave it up to the men to decide when an order is possible or not. If it was impossible, the only proof of that would be their dead bodies lying in the bottom of the trenches. They're scum, Colonel. The whole rotten regiment. A pack of sneaking, whining, tail-dragging curs.
You really believe that, sir?
Yes, I do. That's exactly what I believe. And what's more, it's an incontestable fact.
Why not shoot the entire regiment? I'm perfectly serious.
Well, now, Colonel, you're missing the point entirely. We don't want to slaughter the French army. All we want to do is to set an example.
Oh, well, if it's an example you want, then take me.
Take you?
Yes, sir, if it's an example you want. One man will do as well as 100. The logical choice is the officer most responsible for the attack.
A scene from Stanley Kubrick's great film Paths of Glory. Kirk Douglas, Adolphe Menjou, and George McReady. And now, Bob, here's what I want to mention, that, you know, this is such a small detail in this film, but it's important. Now, you were talking about the pomposity of the generals and the higher officers, as well as being completely out of touch. But what our listeners don't see in this scene is that General, George McReady, that character, has a big scar on his face. It's a huge scar. Now, I think that tips the scales a little bit more. This isn't just an armchair general or a general that's up in some command post doing nothing. Obviously, this general saw combat, unless he tripped at his house and the scar was there. I mean, what makes the general a bit more human, maybe a little less pompous in this, is the fact that this is a general that saw combat, he was wounded. So this isn't just a general, you know, pointing his finger and giving orders. He obviously saw combat and was wounded for it. And so it shades the character a little bit more, I think. He's not totally out of touch here.
I agree with that, Jimmy. In fact, I think that's a good point. And it harkens back to the earlier part of the film when Adolphe Menjou's character, who's the commanding general, proposes the attack to the McReady character. And McReady's first response is, this is impossible. He knew, I mean, I think that bears you out, along with the scar, is he's a professional. Mm-hmm. He knows the attack's doomed. And yet he gets seduced into it with oblique promises of promotion, and this is where his character kind of he sells himself short, and it leads to disaster, basically. So I like that, Jim, because this is Kubrick. It shades of gray. It's not, no one's a complete nincompoop, but yet they act like utter nincompoops, which makes it really inexcusable. And I think we got to play this other part, this other dialogue as well. This is fascinating.
Well, more for the intelligence of the script, here we have a later conversation with Kirk Douglas and Adolphe Menjou, who is, I guess, a general, but he's also into the legal aspects of all this. And again, that sort of complacent, passive voice, you were sort of evading the subject. But in this conversation, I just love it, and the fact that there's what is being spelled out here is, you know, what do generals do? Are they really commanding officers? Are they, you know, in the elite, or are they just sort of the spokesperson for the army and trying to keep everything at a good level? Listen closely to this conversation. Kirk Douglas and Adolphe Menjou from Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory.
Well, Colonel, good evening. Good evening. Come and sit down.
Thank you, sir. I'm really sorry to intrude on you in this way.
Not at all. I'm always delighted to see you, Colonel Dax. Will you have a cigar?
No, thank you, sir. Well, I
think you'll find it delicious. Just apologize for not inviting you to join the party downstairs tonight, but I'm afraid that it's a dress affair.
thank you, sir, but I must confess that this is not entirely a social visit.
Oh, come, Dax, let's not go over all that ground again. Though I must admit that, judging from the casualties, the efforts of your regiment must have been considerable.
How can you understand that and allow these men to be shot tomorrow?
Oh, come, Colonel, you're choosing to take a rather simple view of this thing.
The attack was impossible from the start. The General Staff must have known that.
Colonel Dax, we think we're doing a good job running the war. You must be aware of the fact that the General Staff is subject to all kinds of unfair pressures from newspapers and politicians. Maybe the attack against the anthill was impossible. Perhaps it was an error of judgment on our part. On the other hand, if your men had been a little more daring, they might have taken it. Who knows? In any case, why should we have to bear any more criticism of the failure than we have to? Aside from the inescapable fact that a good many of your men never left the trenches, there's the question of the troops' morale. Don't forget that.
The troops' morale?
Certainly. These executions will be a perfect tonic for the entire division. There are few things more fundamentally encouraging and stimulating than seeing someone else die.
I never thought of that, sir.
Well, you see, Colonel, troops are like children. Just as a child wants his father to be firm, troops crave discipline.
I see.
And one way to maintain discipline is to shoot a man now and then.
May I ask, do you sincerely believe all the things you've just said?
It's been a pleasure discussing this with you, Colonel, but I'm afraid that I better be getting back to my guests.
Oh, from Paths of Glory. Bob, I just love that. It's like, here's the general, and his job is sort of running the war. And he even says, well, I think we're doing a good job running the war, which also involves, he says, talking to newspapers and politicians. And he comes out with the line, oh, you know, it's good for the morale. It's good to shoot a man now and again. It's just pulling the ring in the back of his neck and saying these things that maybe sound good to a newspaper reporter. But talking to Colonel Dax, portrayed by Kirk Douglas, obviously it's a bunch of BS.
Well, you know, Jim, we were talking off the air, folks, saying that we could have talked a whole hour today just on the relationship between Kirk Douglas, George McCready, and Adolphe Menjou in this film. It's so complicated and rich, and that's the Kubrick legacy. I mean, what I'm getting from this is Adolphe Menjou's general is more he seems to figure it's such a terrible calamity that the general staff would be up for criticism. How terrible is that? As opposed to the poor devils who have been slaughtered in the trenches. It seemed like all that mattered to him was, oh, the injustice and how horrible it is that we're up for the press is slamming us because we're a bunch of idiots.
Mm-hmm.
And what about these poor guys that are being stacked up like cordwood because of your dumb decision? And now you're going to shoot some more just to kind of, I mean, the levels of hypocrisy and manipulation are so deep. As a soldier in that army, I'd be horrified. I'd want to shoot him. He's my enemy. As a film goer, this is great stuff. I mean, for 88 minutes, we could talk more. We could talk for hours just about those guys alone. It's fascinating.
We're talking about Paths of Glory, and that's the point where we're going to have to leave you and tell you that next week we will present part 2 of our appreciation of director Stanley Kubrick and his films. It'll be Kirk Douglas in Spartacus starting off next week. I want to thank Andy, our projectionist tonight, and thank you for listening, and we will continue our tribute to Stanley Kubrick next week on Take 2.